And we're live, and good evening, everyone. Welcome again to We Are the Builders Australia. We're on our fourth study. Myself and Lee's actually co-host here too. Please welcome Helen Woolley. Welcome, and how are you?
Oh, I'm good, thanks, Dave. Good, thanks, yeah.
And today we're going back to the start of this book. We Are City Builders, from the Centre of Political Innovation Educational Manual, drafted by Caleb Maupin. And what we'll be doing today is start to read the introduction, which is City Builders, Vandals in Our Age, and we'll be reading up to chapter. We'll be reading then the first four sub-chapters, so 1.1.12 and one up to 1.1.5, and that will cover a fair bit of the topic, and we'll go through the questions after. And I think if anyone wishes to make any comments or any questions, feel free to do so. We'll try to answer them. We don't want to leave it off obviously too late tonight, but obviously if you like to ask us a question, please feel free to put it in the commentary section. Well,
yeah, I think just before we get started, Dave, I think it's just to recap, the last three study classes have been on essentially the evils, if you like, of capitalism, and people explaining in different ways the evilness and the predatory nature of the system that we live under, called capitalism. So I think now we're going back and looking at how did we get to this point in human history? How did we get to this point? And so that's the start of this book, and that's where we're going back to now. So just so people kind of get a feel for why we started in the middle and now why we're going back to the beginning of this book, and that's where we're going.
Yep.
Okay.
So, all right. Just turning on, just keeping a monitor eye on the thing. So I'll just go keep an eye on that. Right. Did you want to start first, or?
Sure. Okay. So page one of the book starts off with Caleb introducing it, and he started to write it in 2018. So the title of page one is City Builders and Vandals in Our Age by Caleb T. Maupin, 2018. So throughout human history, two distinct trends have most certainly been present amongst us. There have always been city builders. They are the innovators, scientists, philosophers, unifiers, heroes, poets, painters, architects, preachers, prophets, dreamers, and visionaries. They include the egalitarians, the solidarity builders, the rationalists, the optimist nonconformists, the bright-eyed rebels, advocates for the downtrodden, inspirers and motivators. In essence, those individuals who push civilization towards a higher state of being. They are driven by an inner flame of creativity and boldness. These city builders have always stood in opposition to the efforts of the Vandals. These are the raiders, the machine breakers, the hate mongers, the ignorance celebrators, the jealousy peddlers, the demagogues, the cultists, the hedonists, self-destructive stoics. They are wreckers, persecutors, lynch mob leaders, dope pushers, snake oil salesmen, sadists, crucifiers, vulgar emotionalists, crass pornographers, bullies and bombers who often worship darkness and primitiveness. The designation of left and right in politics are rather new relative to the history of human civilization.
On May the 5th, 1789, the people of France formed a national assembly. This was the body that would lay the basis for the revolution and the toppling of the feudal monarchy. Baron de Guaville described the scene, saying, "We began to recognise each other. Those who were loyal to religion and the king took up positions to the right of the chair so as to avoid the shouts, oaths and indecencies that enjoyed free rein in the opposing camp. In 1791, those who sat on the left side of the French National Assembly The opposing camp, to those defending the old regime, began referring to themselves as the innovators. Soon, society at large began referring to them as the left. The concept of left and right in politics did not spread beyond France for at least half a century after that. The idea of socialism is even newer, emerging as a vaguely defined concept in the early 1800s in France, and not first used in the English language until 1822. Marxism did not originate as a movement until 1848. These concepts, left, right, socialism, Marxism, are anything but eternal and in their short life. They have already encompassed a wide variety of diverse ideals and figures. I'll just finish these two chapters. However, these two distinct trends, city builders and vandals, have existed since the dawn of human history and class society. From the very moment we began domesticating animals and growing crops, there were those who wanted to perfect our ability to do so and drive us towards a more advanced way of being. And from the moment of civilization's birth, there have been those who wanted us to regress back toward hunter-gatherer civilization and reduce ourselves to a lifestyle closer to that of lower primates. The essence of the ongoing battle that has raged between civilizations and cultures, within civilizations and cultures, and even within individuals themselves, has boiled down to this question: will human beings utilize their gift of rationalism and creativity to progress towards greater achievements and a better world? Or will they reject the distinct essence of humanness and descend towards the conditions of less intelligent species?
Dave, you're getting some kind of feedback on your sound.
Just so what I'll do when you'll start next year, I'll put myself on mute, and then vice versa. I think that's where the feedback's coming from.
Yeah. Okay.
So over to you.
All right. So the legacy of Gilgamesh, Confucius, and Socrates. In describing the uniqueness of the human species, Friedrich Engels, Marx's close collaborator, observed, the animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends, masters it. This is the final essential distinction between man and other animals. Engels' observation was correct, and it has been mastering the environment and creating better conditions for human beings so that we might live longer and in better comfort. That has been the task of city builders in every age. As civilization dawned, the city building tendency manifested itself on every continent and among every people. No region or society had a monopoly on innovation. In the Americas, the Incas and Mayas built pyramids and beautiful metropolises. In Africa, we saw the rise of city-states like Timbuktu and Carthage, and eventually the wonders of Egypt. Confucius and his brilliance lives on to this day in the unfolding victories of Chinese civilization after 5,000 years. In what is now Iraq, we saw the birth of a civilization called Mesopotamia. The central myth of this society was told in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The legend told of the protagonist, Gilgamesh, battling the bull of heaven, a mighty and powerful creature. Gilgamesh was able to defeat this massive animal by employing his intelligence. The narrative explains that despite being smaller and weaker, human beings are indeed superior to even the largest and most powerful beasts. The spark of creativity and the ability of rational thinking and collective effort makes us superior to all other species, no matter how large and powerful. The modern-day tradition of bullfighting can be traced back to Mesopotamia, where the legend of Gilgamesh was acted out in the ritual to demonstrate the distinction between humans and animals.
The great thinkers of Athens articulated notions of democracy and wrangled with the nature of truth and reality. Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy, was put to death because his ideas were too threatening to the status quo. Socrates was accused of corrupting the minds of the youth and creating sympathy for Sparta, the rival city-state. The words of Socrates on his deathbed, as recounted in Plato's Phaedo, point towards the common mindset of city builders in every age. Socrates told his followers, When he knew his execution was imminent, the same dream came to me, sometimes in one form and sometimes in another. They're always saying that the same or nearly the same words cultivate and make music. Excuse me for a sec. I'll just cross that out. Sorry. Socrates believed that human beings were not simply animals avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, but that they had a higher intellectual ability, a soul capable of reasoning and construction. Socrates, braver in becoming a martyr for the cause of civilization, set a bold example for heroes of the future. Socrates became more powerful after death than he was in life. His ideas were preserved by those he taught and were utilized in training great minds for thousands of years, illustrating a kind of immortality for progressive thinkers. Reactionary thought and Vandal mindsets certainly manifested themselves as humanity marched onward in spite of them. The Roman Empire was a great manifestation of barbarism and savagery. Rome was a military society founded on holding back history, plundering other peoples and living off tribute and slaves, extracted at the point of a spear. The founding myth of Rome presents a message that seems completely opposed to the founding myth of Mesopotamia and illustrates the difference between the two civilizations. At the end.
The legend of Rome's The legend of Rome's founding told of two twin brothers abandoned by their father and left to die by the river as infants. Romulus and Remus, according to the legend, were never loved and cared for by humans, but rather were nursed and raised by a she-wolf. The Romans believed that the strength which enabled the two co-founders to establish the mighty empire flowed from their lack of humanity. The lack of human affection and the exposure to the wild predator mentality was believed to have enabled Romulus and Remus to grow into effective conquerors who could establish a slave society. In the Roman Empire, cruelty, sadism, and indifference towards the suffering of others were celebrated traits, actively cultivated by the rulers. As Rome's agricultural and industrial output gradually decreased with a highly inefficient slave system of production in its plantations and mines, Rome continued to make up the difference by conquering other people. The German scholar Kautsky reflected on Rome's reactionary nature, writing, "The slave economy did not denote a technical advance, but a step backwards. Not only did it make the masters impotent and incapable of working and increase the number of unproductive workers in society, but it also cut down the productivity of the productive workers and checked the progress of technology with the possible exception of some luxury trades. Like every mode of production that is founded on contradictions, the ancient slave economy dug its own grave. In the form it finally took in the Roman world empire, it was based on war. It was only continual victorious wars, continual subjugation of new nations, continual extension of the territory of the empire that could supply the masses of cheap slave material it required. The Roman Republic had a hereditary Senate, elected representatives and elements of democracy for the simple reason that this was a better way of motivating its citizenry to plunder. A population that feels somehow involved in the business of governing and the distribution of loot is far more motivated to join wars of conquest than those who simply exist as subjects of an autocrat. However, the limited democratic procedures within the city-state empire proved to be too dangerous to the small elite of families who had the actual power.
Okay, 1.1.2, the death of Julius Caesar. The typical Roman was a hedonist who bet money on Colosseum fights and chariot races while seeking pleasure from...
Sorry, Dave, can I just interrupt? Can you move closer to the mic?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better. Okay?
All right. Give me a moment. I'll just sort that out. I'll start that again. The death of Julius Caesar. The typical Roman was a hedonist who bet money on Colosseum fights and chariot races while seeking pleasure from orgies, drunkenness, and overeating, often to the point of induced vomit. The archetype of a shallow, pleasure-hungry sadist was actively cultivated by the empire. These included gladiatorial shows, infanticide, and other barbaric practices designed to stimulate the primitive side of the human mind. For the minority of Romans, whose intellect would not allow them to be satisfied by hedonism, the Stoic cults emerged to satisfy their need to define deeper meaning in life. For the Stoics, the sadism of Roman life was replaced by a glorified masochism, dressed up in a spiritual and philosophical pretensions. Romans who wanted more meaning in their lives than physical pleasure and cruelty would induce states of supposed mysticism with ritualized self-mutilation, flagellation, or even starvation. The Stoics would drug themselves in order to have hallucinations, believing this to be the way of connecting to divinity. The Stoic Romans would worship some new god imported from part of the empire, forming little cults in the hopes of finding truths concealed by the official imperial gods. The Stoic Romans, who longed for something more out of life, would often be preyed upon the philosophical conmen like Seneca. These charlatans preached on the supposed ethical merits of poverty while demanding huge sums in tribute from their flock. The apparent hypocrisy of various Stoic gurus and preachers became the subject of many Roman comedies. While the Romans who rejected the hedonism and cruelty of the empire were more intelligent and had potential to create real change, their ability to break with societal norms was simply channeled into another avenue of self-destruction. I'll just finish this bit. Yet, even within this nightmare of historical reaction called the Roman Empire, the city-building tendency within humanity asserted itself. Julius Caesar, a military man born among the aristocracy, emerged in the late Roman Republic to present a progressive vision. Michael Parenti's award-winning book of political science and historiography, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, People's History of Ancient Rome, tells of a maligned populist and reformer who championed everyday Romans against the wealthy landowners. Parenti writes, he used state power to effect some limited benefits to small farmers, debtors, and the urban proletariat, at the expense of the wealthy few. No matter how limited these reforms proved to be, the oligarchs never forgave him, and so Caesar met the same fate as other Roman reformers before him.
Parenti's book, recounting the life and death of Julius Caesar, was the 2004 online review of books non-fiction book of the year. The same year that Parenti published his widely praised text, the Caucus for New Political Science gave him the Career Achievement Award. Parenti's scholarship was groundbreaking because it showed Julius Caesar in a completely different light, challenging the narrative put forward by William Shakespeare and the Roman historians who favoured the perspective of the wealthy elite. Parenti draws from the words of those who demonise Caesar to show that their contempt was rooted in their own class interest. Parenti quotes sources such as the Greek biographer and essayist Plutarch, who accused Caesar of stirring up and attaching himself to numerous diseased and corrupted elements in polity. Parenti also quotes Appian, another Roman historian, who describes Caesar as having introduced laws to better the conditions of the poor. The specifics of Caesar's reform shows him as a thoroughly progressive-minded leader. Caesar sent the unemployed proletarians of Rome to rebuild city-states throughout the empire in the hopes of making them thriving centers of trade. Caesar constructed public libraries, giving the citizenry access to written records and information. Caesar cracked down on moneylenders, lifted the restrictions and penalties on debtors, and imposed luxury taxes on the decadent rich. Caesar granted Roman citizenships to all doctors and teachers, hoping to reward and cultivate the kind of people who would make Rome a center of political science and civilization and culture. Caesar was appointed by the Senate for a 10-year term as imperator, or Roman head of state, On 3 occasions, Caesar was offered a crown, but each time he declined to become a monarch. Despite being a strong man, Caesar remained an advocate of democracy and was loved by the people. His power came from the thousands of Roman proletarians, free citizens with no property, who saw him as their champion against the wealthy landowners and senators. This mobilization of the people as a populist made Caesar far more powerful than any king or emperor could ever be.
Caesar's vision for reconstructing Roman society involved mobilizing millions of people, not as plundering raiders extracting tribute, but as city builders continuing the great project of making music for which Socrates had been executed by a similarly cruel, short-sighted elite. Parenti explains the Senate aristocrats killed Caesar because they perceived him to be the popular leader who threatened their privileged interests. The greatest sin of Julius Caesar in the eyes of the Roman elite was his talk of land redistribution, ensuring that a tiny oligarchy would not maintain a monopoly over the main sources of wealth for Roman society, the mines and plantations. Parenti quotes Plutarch in describing how Caesar's land reform law provided that almost the whole Campania be divided among the poor and needy. Caesar also talked of granting citizenship to people throughout the rest of the empire. Parenti quotes Roman historian Cicero, who bemoaned that Caesar planned to confer citizenship not merely on individuals but on entire nations and provinces. If people in Central Europe, Persia, North Africa, and other conquered lands would join the Roman people in settling the policies and enjoying the fruits of the empire, the civilization might be more sustainable. Having championed the common people, Julius Caesar was stabbed to death in the hall of the Roman Senate. Parenti explains the assassination. Caesar was branded a traitor to his class by members of that class. He committed the unforgivable sin of trying to redistribute, albeit in modest portions, some of the wealth that the very rich tirelessly siphoned from the state coffers from the labour of the many. It was unforgivable that he should tamper with the system of upward expropriation that they embraced as their birthright. Caesar seems not to have comprehended that in the conflict between the haves and the have-nots, the haves are really have-it-alls. The Roman aristocrats lambasted the palest reforms of the worst kind of thievery, the beginning of a calamitous revolutionary levelling, necessitating extreme countermeasures. And they presented their violent retaliation not as an ugly class expediency, but as an honourable act on behalf of republican liberty. The assassination of Julius Caesar, though it was met with riots and rebellions among the people, ultimately doomed Roman civilization. Some of the very senators who had stabbed Caesar wept by his funeral pyre. They realised that their empire needed a progressive thinker, a strong leader, an advocate of kindness, compassion and solidarity to lead it towards something better. But yet, in love with their own profits, the greedy and rich had stabbed to death the very person who could save their empire from its own self-destructive Vandal tendencies.
Sounds a bit like what's happening today. We've got some greedy nations that are have some self-destructive Vandal tendencies.
Gee, I wonder who they are.
Yeah. So the demise of the Roman Republic, marked by the stabbing of the greatest advocate in creation, was a historical turning point that paved the way for the empire's eventual decline and fall. With any notion of democracy being too dangerous to the rich and powerful, Rome descended into a naked autocracy with a string of emperors who claimed to be gods, leading it further and further down the road to decay. After the eventual fall of Rome came the Dark Ages and huge setbacks for civilizations in Europe. As Rome declined, the weary and demoralized public began to give Stoics the upper hand. In its final years, Romans began trading in Bacchus, the god of pleasure and orgies, for a sanitized and redacted image of Jesus Christ, first worshipped secretly among the Jewish craftsmen. The Roman Emperor Constantine is said to have seen a cross in the dark sky and heard the words, in hoc signo vinces. In other words, under the sign you shall conquer, inspiring his conversion to Christianity. However, history showed the opposite of what was supposedly promised as a divine voice, as Rome adopted a symbol representing a humble carpenter who preached a gospel of loving one's enemy. The savage empire crumbled. The fact that the Roman Empire fell almost simultaneously with its official embrace of Christianity has long been met with defensiveness by Christian scholars and historians. St. Augustine's book, The City of God, considered to be one of the most vital theological works in the history of Christianity, was intended to address this point. However, no defensiveness is really necessary. The teachings of Jesus Christ were obviously not intended for the purpose of building a society based on plunder. And the fact that they would play a role in destroying rather than strengthening such an empire should not be surprising. In the twilight years, once the powerful militaristic city-state could not even raise its own armies, the Germanic tribes, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, and the Visigoths played a pivotal role in Rome's ultimate demise, did not even battle Roman centurions. The decaying empire was so weak that it fought the Germanic tribes not with its own soldiers, but by hiring other Germanic tribes to fight on its behalf. As it reached its end, an empire founded on military plunder was so weak that it could not raise its own army to defend itself. Despite the reactionary nature of the Roman world order, the fall of Rome made conditions far worse. It took 1,100 years before Europe's population returned to what it had been at the height of the Roman Empire. The average height of people dramatically decreased due to the decline in nourishment and caloric intake. In their orgy of destruction, the barbarian tribes made a point of burning books and records and attempted to erase scientific progress. The barbarians of Central Europe had essentially beaten the Romans at their own game. The dying empire was brought down by pagan tribes who worshipped Odin, a god of valor and grit who seemed to embody the animalistic tendencies of Romulus and Remus. Unlike the Romans, the Goths and Vandals did not even construct cities, but lived in the woods as nomadic raiders, plundering what prior civilizations had built. They ushered in an era of huge setbacks and very little human progress.
The new order forged by revolutionaries. After centuries of feudalism and serfdom, it was a change in political theory, sparked by changes in the economy that paved the way for something better. The Renaissance was not a random occurrence. In Italy, Britain, Bavaria, and other parts of Europe, the dawn of the Silk Road from Asia and travellers' observations of other civilizations in the Middle East, China, and elsewhere inspired a strand of progressive thinking. The achievements of the Islamic Enlightenment, an age of reform in the Arab world, as well as China's great advances, gradually trickled into the Western world despite brutal institutions that sought to repress them. Much like Socrates had experienced, often those who promoted science and questioned the backward nature of things were met with repression. Often those accused of alchemy or heresy were tortured, imprisoned, or burned at the stake. Yet, despite so many setbacks, the flame of human progress was not extinguished. New ideas were smuggled in and secret societies of educated people began to form in order to share the forbidden knowledge, one after another. Forward-thinking monarchs who aligned themselves with the new layer of travellers and thinkers began to encourage scientific research as well as groundbreaking artistic endeavours. The music of Bach, the paintings of Michelangelo, and the empowerment of figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Thomas More all flowed from a new mindset regarding the nature of government. In the Dark Ages, the feeling was that human beings were obliged to serve their natural superiors. However, the paradigm shift from defined Renaissance of the 14th to 17th centuries was the notion of statecraft, the feeling that those who govern have an obligation to improve the conditions of the citizenry and serve the people. With a few forward-thinking monarchs allowing them thoughts to bloom, the inner light of humanity began to glow once again in Europe. When Copernicus, composed his earth-shaking text on the revolution of heavenly spheres in 1543, The text was simply a presentation of what he had discovered with mathematical calculations and his primitive telescope. The text had no mention of politics in it, but the political implications were explosive. Copernicus had argued that the scientific method was a superior mechanism for finding truth, and what the Catholic Church claimed about the Earth being the centre of the universe was false. Those who accepted the scientific method and belief in rational thinking began to refer to themselves as revolutionaries. The revolutionaries believed that the Earth revolved around the sun, and more importantly, they believed in science and human reason. Across Europe, the revolutionaries conspired, sometimes openly and sometimes in secret, to challenge the feudal order and place it with something that would no longer restrain human progress. Over to you.
The Korean invention of the printing press, utilized for the first time in Europe by Johann Gutenberg, opened the door to the Protestant Reformation. By the late 1700s, revolutionaries were on the upswing, speaking of a new order protecting natural rights or the rights of man. Talk of life, liberty, and property, and liberty, egalite, fraternity swept the world. Feudalism fell among a wave of optimism. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, marking the first step towards the creation of the modern United States, is awash with slogans and sentiments of that era. It speaks of human beings as being endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. It speaks of the moral imperative to revolt against unjust social conditions. As the 19th century dawned, red banners and declarations of liberty were on display across the Western world. Kings and nobles were beheaded. Millions of peasants marched into battle in order to topple old principalities and to forge modern nation states with their muskets and bayonets. The old order, of course, scoffed with contempt at those who brought about its demise. Robert Thomas Mathis coined the term overpopulation. He proclaimed that the unrest was all due to the birth rate expanding faster than the food supply. The Spanish Inquisition, anti-Semitic pogroms, and various episodes of genocide and repression marked the vengeful scorn of a dying order. As capitalism dawned, the feudal lords were replaced with factory owners, and the power of kings were usurped by the bankers. Peasants were driven from their lands and pushed into urban areas where they became wage workers. A new social order emerged from the ashes of the old. The dawn of the new social system, hailed as glorious, was wrought with horrors and inhumanity. A genocide cleared the Scottish Highlands. Millions of Irish people were starved in a man-made famine. Colonialism in Africa and the Americas, the slaughter of native people, and the transnational slave trade laid the foundations of what would eventually become the global market. And we're going to leave the reading at that point, and we've got a series of questions that we're going to ask each other, and we'll have a discussion about the text and how it relates to what's happening today.
And just before I continue on, I do apologise. I pronounced some words and names wrong in this. It was quite challenging, some of these long words, one or the other. Well, we got through it. And also to a big shout out to Dust James. He's the main host, but we co-host together Working Class Revolt every weekend, 10 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, which is 8 p.m. US Eastern Time. And also pardon me if I pronounce this wrong, but a Bantu from Turkey. Hello, big greetings and welcome aboard, comrade. All right, so how we go through this now? The questions. Do you want me to ask the first three questions, or?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, this is for the first introduction. Who are the Vandals of today? Who are the city builders? Is primitivism right wing or left wing? Why? Is innovation a necessary part of leftism? If so, how can we nurture it?
All right, so if we go back to question one, who are the Vandals of today and who are the city builders? I think for anybody watching the news with an open mind, we'd have to say that The imperialist nations of the world are the Vandals of today. They're roaming around the world, creating wars, creating starvation, creating illnesses, and the city builders, of course, are those that are trying to build independent city-states, or rather nation-states. And you know, if we look at what the imperialists are doing around the world to try and stop the city builders, placing sanctions and trade embargoes and economic war on countries that are trying to develop independent nation states, then we can easily single out who the city builders are. And so we'd have to say things like, you know, countries like Venezuela, China, Iraq, Iran, Yemen,
Nicaragua. Now it was Bolivia and now Peru.
Bolivia. Congratulations to Peru. And so we see this a whole world developing that are trying to develop independence away from the imperialist nations that are trying to conquer them even more and rape and pillage and plunder their natural wealth, and of course that puts them in the bracket of being the Vandals of today.
And the G7 just recently happened over the weekend. Was a classic example of that. What we mean by imperialism, it's not a policy, it's a social system we live under. It is now, and it's capitalism at its highest stage, and it just shows you how repressive. It's interesting, our Prime Minister, or it's not our Prime Minister, but Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, how he was over there receiving his orders, and trying to also too, he's also a Vandal. He's trying to argue that we should keep fossil fuel going. Australia's interest, you know, King Coal, don't want to make action on climate change, which is still a very important issue we need to address and need a working class solution too. But I was just listening to a radio report from Critical Hour today, and it was quite interesting. Mentioned Joe Biden, obviously the media and all the establishment there's telling him to go and tell Russia to stop intervening, and put this whole conspiracy that Russia's intervening in their elections and internal affairs and everything else. And all basically Putin's going to say is no, because they're not. But it just shows you they're trying to actually trying to save a decaying system. NATO's pretty much shot to pieces. And the military strength is pretty much all shot to pieces everywhere. And you can just see it's a dying system. But they are the ones who are trying to wreck and destroy to keep trying to preserve that dying system even further.
And I think it's important to see that when you need to increase your military budget exponentially every year in order to maintain the status quo or maintain the system, then quite clearly they are the Vandals. They are the Vandals roaming the earth, plundering other nations, their natural resources, their natural wealth, the labor of other countries in order to bolster their own economies and so on. It's clear to see who the Vandals really are in today's world. You don't see China going around the world with placing military bases around the world, and yet America has. I'm going to have a stab in the dark here and say 400 or 500 around the world. China, I think, has maybe I don't know, let's say 10. There's a huge difference in the ratio of how much money other countries spend in war compared to the United States. The top three nations under the United States spend as much combined as the United States. So the Vandals are clearly obvious to people if you want to look at it. But if you want to believe what our mass media is telling us, then you might have a different opinion about who the Vandals are and who the city builders are.
Yeah. And beside behind the respective governments is who really is right controlling the shows. The major multinationals. It'd be the big oil. It would be big King Coal, and other ones that are looking to try and maintain it, or even if they're not going to exactly extract any natural resources out of any particular country, they want to maintain their control. And they want to actually keep the old system, but also not just size the big oil on that. We also look at the media as well. And any other type of big multinational out there. They're the ones who dictate policy to government. And for example, we're copying these free trade agreements, the latest one with the UK. Now, what's really in the detail? No one knows anything about it. It was all done behind closed doors. I wouldn't be surprised it's already been drafted up already, and then just go, and everyone in Parliament will be told directly to vote on it. And simple as that. So that comes to show you they're the Vandals. So look what happens to all these these policies are implemented. And look at this neoliberal policy. Look what's what happens to working class communities and then regional communities. It causes massive decimation to it. Okay. Did you want to say anything more on the other two questions, or we'll move on to the next one?
No, we can move on. Move on. Yeah. So I'll ask you this one, Dave. Is primitivism left wing or right wing or left wing? Why?
That's a good question, because historically, progress, that for many years, I mean, it goes right back to the French Revolution times, was actually what we called then what we deemed the left, which was obviously explained early in the chapter how that was formed during that time. They formed the opposition. The thing is, it's I can't really. It's not exactly left wing or right wing anymore. It's because sometimes they have those in right wing traditional ones, like conservative, that want to establish an older old order, or just want to preserve things as they are. The old saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it, etc. So they want to conserve a particular system. But when we're looking at things with the right wing, left wing, what does that actually define us now? And because there are those who are left wing, actually praise destruction as well, like burn it down, tear it down, smash this, smash that. And they don't actually come up with any type of building exercise at all. It's just complete destruction. There's even those left in the environment. They're saying, well, if you're really cold, put a jumper on. Why can't we put an air conditioner on? Oh, I might use too much energy. Or the other one, there's too many people on the planet that we must reduce. I've seen it on both sides of politics. So it's not. So we should reduce that. And then we know historically what happens when we go down that path. We've seen it. It's in history. Its history is clearly shown to it. I'll just mention World War II, Nazi Germany. You want to see massive reduction in population on industrial scale? There you go. And even right up to the modern time. But as I said, it's not distinctly right wing and left wing, because there are those parts we actually say there's too many people. We should reduce population. And I think we've got to understand where this comment is primitivism just applied to the right wing. No, it's not. It's actually it's right across the whole broad political spectrum. And I like how this is put this way. What's the about city builders and vandals, and that's really more defined of what we are. Are you a city builder or are you a vandal? And I think that's what we're coming to us. We're on the side of the city builders, where the others are reaching destruction, smash it down, whatever, crush, and offering instability, the whole lot. Then they form in the Vandals. So I look at it this way for Australia here. It's not just distinctly just for the right wing, especially the far right. There's also on the left as well. Not everybody, but it's. I think I'll throw it out there. I'm probably going to get shot down in flames by people on the internet, but hey, I'm putting it out there. I'm just telling it as it is too. So, and if those who want to shoot me down for it, well, I've just put the mirror up in their faces for that.
I think though that primitivism is the idea that or the notion that anything forward thinking is could be conceived of as being as something negative. So rather than pushing forward into new types of society or new types of ideas that can unite and build new cities and new states of human consciousness and so on, is that let's keep things unsophisticated. Let's keep things primitive, and that's not a word that I'm using in the sense of cultures or societies, but it's the idea of keeping things backward, if you like, or in a unsophisticated and simple. And that's not what building a city, city builders want to do. City builders want to move forward. We have to be moving forward as human beings, as human society. We have to move forward. And so primitivism then therefore must be considered a reactionary force to be dealt with, because rather than wanting human civilization to go forward, it wants to keep us going, either maintaining the status quo or worse, heading in a backward way. So I take your point about it. We see elements of that in both left and right wing politics for sure. But the question is kind of asking is that primitivism is it a positive thing or is it a negative thing? And I think we'd have to say that it's a negative thing for humanity.
Yes.
We need to be pushing forward. We need to be developing new ideas. We need to be allowing every individual to reach their full potential. We are individuals within our society. We need to be nurturing all of ourselves as individuals, but we need to be doing it in order to create a better world, not to benefit ourselves as individuals. And then that's going back to what Einstein was saying last week in last week's discussion. So yeah, I think we would reject the notion of primitivism. I think we would reject the notion of really the notion of being a hippie, going back to earthy lifestyles, and it's wonderful, maybe in part, but humanity can't do it. So it's wonderful for individuals that can afford it to go back and live with nature and so on. But can human society do that? No, we can't. So it must be considered a negative concept.
We should be looking to build as well higher production systems where, like we're no longer feudal, but there are those who want to take us back to feudalism, aka fascists, Nazis, etc. They all those on the extreme right, all that would sort of take us back to a type of feudal order. But yeah, Edmund and his others who want to still maintain the status quo, but that's obviously leading us into a destructive path. We do need to move forward to a higher level mode of production, and that is where production is geared around for the benefit of society and on a central plan, and benefiting everybody in society, not just benefiting the few anymore. And last. Well, you've obviously the other one is which actually goes into this one, is innovation a necessary part of leftism? If so, how can we nurture it?
Yeah, I think we kind of answered that question in that whole discussion there. Absolutely, innovation is part of leftism. It's where we want to be constantly heading, and you said it. The material conditions for moving forward and for being creative and for being innovative is the mode of production. The more that we can create, so that people have time and energy to be able to be innovative, then the better off society will be. At the moment, it's that old story of when we produce too much, people get laid off from work, so then they can't buy anything. So then we have to wait until the crisis is over, and then we all get employed again, and we can, but in the meantime, people are going hungry. People don't know how to pay the bills. So how can society and how can people be productive and how can people be innovative when they're living under those kind of conditions? Sure, some can, but not. We want to create a society where everybody can be part of that innovation, part of that creativity, and people achieving the best thing that they can be. It's a wonderful concept.
I was actually thinking too, just to acknowledge John, he made mention about free trade agreements and floating around. I think actually someone actually correctly pointed out, and I was involved in discussion in the union, it actually should be called what they really are, low-wage police-state agreements. And that's what they are. They're trying to drive the whole world. Free trade agreements are in fact low-wage police-state ones. They're driving the whole planet into a low-wage police-state on our world, and that's what the main objectives are currently on with big multinationals, bourgeoisie, whatever we want to call them in these days. So interesting point John's raised there. All right. Well, next questions from the first part. How do we change our environment to suit us?
Well, I think first of all we have to determine what it is that suits us. So we have, we have to get a commonality. We have to understand that we have to be united in what it is that we want to change, and then we can decide how are we going to change it, and we can decide what suits us as well. But while we're living in a system such as we are, where we don't, we're not united. We don't see that we are all in this same situation together. That for now we're being held back by the idea that we're individuals, and we need to get united and work out how we're going to, or what it is that we need to change to. And I guess in answering that, then from our perspective, we'd have to say that we want to change our environment to create more for everybody. And so I think we kind of answered that question as well a wee bit as well.
Yeah. All right. I don't think I'd really need to add on anything now. I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head. Otherwise, it's just repeating what was said.
Yeah. Well, but there is this whole question of the environment, and I think I think people might see that as being the weather or the conditions or whatever, and that is true. But of course, unless we tackle the issue of who controls the means of production, we can't tackle the question of the environment. We can't tackle the question of climate change until we can tackle the question of who owns the means of production, who is the ones that are creating the pollution, who are the ones that are destroying the environment, and then we can address how are we going to change it. But if we don't recognize that fundamentally it's who owns the means of production are the ones that are creating the climatic catastrophe that we're dealing with now, then how can we change it?
Yeah. That's right.
So I'll ask you the next question, Dave. How can we learn from ancient legends and myths?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of literature and a lot of history there to learn from, and we've got so much we can learn from how they, especially one of the most important ones we should learn from are the big mistakes, the hard lessons. The best lessons are the hardest, it's hardest of all of them. And not just, I wouldn't just say about legends and myths either. I think for anything from our own past experiences, but we've got a whole wealth of knowledge now, how that we can build a new society. Even right up to our contemporary society now, how can we go about things? And we've got the Soviet Union to learn from, we've got China to learn from, many others as well, and especially what happened within the 20th century. But most important thing is we've got so much to study and learn from, but blindly follow none either. Obviously, a lot of, going back to Julius Caesar's times, there was a lot of contradictions, and which became very antagonistic. They weren't widely dealt with. And I think we do need to learn that, how these contradictions come to an antagonism or to and how we do about it. And one thing that's most importantly doing, it's not just the individual, it's the collective, it's the movement. It's not the movement, but it's the movement of people that are prepared to make those changes as well. And I think that's something important. There's one thing, yes, it's aspired to have some sort of figurehead or some individual, and an individual does play a role, but it's only, and I'll just quote Chairman Mao, I mean, it's the masses that make history. And that's what was an important thing right through it, and what we've been reading so far is in this dialectical, it just didn't magically change overnight. It just didn't happen to get here like as is for some unknown reason. It happened because the masses were organised in such a way to change it. They had the extra knowledge to provide them. Yes, the individual did provide it, learning from new sciences and experiment, but also working collectively with others and moving forward. So I think that's the most important thing is, and I mean, you look, as I said, I'll use Julius Caesar for example. He wasn't the only one, right, that was making the change. Yes, he was the main one to drive. He pushed it, and they obviously wanted to cut the head off the snake. As I was just saying, I hate to use that term. He wasn't a snake, but he had to remove the head somewhere, and that's what obviously caused. What the aftermath after that was just chaos and disorganisation. So it had to be one of the things we can learn about ancient legends and myths. I mean, they do tell us a story about how what were the lessons, what happened, what failed, what can we learn from that, but also too what worked and what we can learn from that, and how we can and what can we do today to move forward. And also the most important thing is change is inevitable. It can happen. It might take centuries. It might take a few years. Hell, it could happen within in the next 20 years. Who knows? I mean, I haven't got a crystal ball. I can't mention it, but it can actually show from this that change can happen.
Yeah, okay. I would agree with that. There were several things that you touched on that I might have expanded on, but I think I think what you said was brilliant.
Now, the question for that, the next one was, what would be a progressive myth today? What would be a reactionary myth?
Well, I think that if you had to write a progressive myth that is going to last forever, I think it has to be the story of the Soviet Union. I think China. I think Venezuela, Cuba. The story of people developing new societies out of the struggle, out of the demise of the old, is a legend and a myth that will be told forever. And humanity has should pay great gratitude to these countries that are leading the way and showing us showing us what can happen and how we can do it. And we owe them a debt of gratitude. And so I think their myth will and their legend will live on forever in the history books. A reactionary myth, we'd have to say we'd have to say that the belly of the beast of imperialism is the reactionary myth that we're living with today, and people that are living in the United States are doing a fantastic job of trying to minimize the damage that beast is doing around the world, and I think in many places doing a fantastic job. They're just not united enough at the moment to pull together under the one banner. They haven't come to the conclusion that things need to change. But even that's not true, actually, because so many Americans know that things have to change. So many British people are living in the belly of the beast as well. you know, and here in Australia as an outlying ally of those two imperialist nations, we also, you know, are coming to the conclusion that things have to change. And so, you know, I think even though we live in a reactionary, you know, position and living in these countries, that myth can also, and that legend will also change over time.
I think actually one classic example of a reactionary myth, it's like socialism doesn't work. We're inherently greedy. It's always been like this. That's the myth. And that you know, we already at, you know, this is the end of history. This is where we cannot develop any further. And it was actually a very classic example when I won't say it's the fall, it was a deliberate dismantling of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, and we had this complete myth that, you know, we're at the highest stage now, and and the other one, but the progressive myth we can put forward, well, no, it can be done. Socialism does work. It's not a myth, actually, it's the truth, and humans can achieve it to a higher level of higher level of society or production, etc. I mean, it can be done. History's shown it, and otherwise we'd still be stuck in the dark ages. Otherwise, All right. Well, this next question. Yeah, I think
that was a brilliant point. Absolutely brilliant point. Yeah. So I'll ask you the next question, Dave. I'm just going to jump a couple of questions because I think we'll run out of time otherwise.
Yeah.
So, is America the new Roman Empire?
Whoa, that's actually a very good question. I would say yes to a certain degree. It basically, I think, if you have a look at, and I'll just actually throw architecture in here for a sec. You look at the White House, Capitol Hill, it's very Roman type. And I believe some architecture, and you actually have a look how they've actually structured themselves, some of the laws and numerals they use. They were very influenced by Rome. And there was some they actually found in America that actually wanted to have a new Rome. They wanted to expand and build a new Rome. And that's, and obviously there are those now who even actually think along that line as a particular empire. Obviously, Rome only covered a particular part of the world at the time, North Africa, Mediterranean, and including like West Asia, Middle East, and Europe. Not all Europe, but some of Europe and parts of Britain. But where the US actually now covers most of the globe, not all of it completely, obviously, and their military so far stretched, but it's also far outdated as well. I mean, they built these new planes called the F-35s, and as test pilots say, it's like flying a piano, it's trying to fly a piano. They've got aircraft carriers that, basically need consistent repair, and they can't even get rid of now. And they're so fuel dependent, and all the time. A lot of other countries are reducing their military spending, so they're stepping in the mode even more to try and sustain a system that's basically decaying. It's falling down, and they're trying to prop it up. And I'm seeing this. If you want to make the equivalent, making the comparisons with Rome, similar thing. That's what's happening there as well. The system was dying; it's collapsing. And they're going to be pushed to such a degree one day they've got nothing else but to prop them up. It will just go. Yeah, it will implode.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Did you want me to ask a couple more questions from that particular one? Because we'll probably want to finish up soon.
Well, I think this next one, why is democracy dangerous for the owning class? I think that's important. Primarily because democracy, of course, is the uniting of all of the people in society to have a say in that society. And we, unfortunately, and this probably could be also one of the reactionary myths, is that we live in a democracy. That's an utter lie that we live in some kind of democracy. And so real democracy of course, would be extremely dangerous for the owning class. If we had a say in how our factories were run, if we had a say in how much was produced, if we had a say in a true say in who could be elected, not based on how much money somebody has and how much they can influence or lobby governments and lobby our local elections and create fraudulent elections and so on. So if we had true elections where we could elect the people that we really wanted to, based on free choice, not based on what the media is pushing us towards either. So we don't live in a democratic society, and really socialism is a new form of a democratic society. It's so much more democratic than capitalist society. And so, of course, the owning class hate the concept of democracy. They love the concept of going to the polls every 4 years, but that's not democracy.
Exactly, a superficial democracy, to call us, and I think that's, and obviously too with the two-party system, but it's also alienates the common people away from the actual being participate in all levels of government and the institutions and everything else. But all these laws, everything that's passed is there to uphold and maintain that profit, and that's what it comes down to. So that's why true democracy is dangerous to the owning class, because then their power would be challenged. Hence why they've got repressive laws such as anti-trade union legislation or anti-anything, anyone sort of legislation, and why they want to build more detention centres, more prisons, etc., etc. It's there. It's obviously they're trying to maintain their rule. Well, look, I'll jump on to the next one. We'll ask a couple of these questions. These are quite interesting. Does Thomas Malthus' theory of overpopulation play a role today in politics? If so, how so? And if just for those of you who don't know Thomas Malthus is, you probably heard of Malthusianism. There's a lot of.
Yeah, well, I think the crux of the matter with Malthusianism is that essentially he's laying the blame on the ordinary people for the economic ills of a country or of a system. So there he's saying, well, if we didn't have so many people, really referring to the working class, if we didn't have so many working class people breeding, then we wouldn't have these ills of our society today. Well, that's not really true, because capitalism is the ill of our society. Capitalism is the toxic, predatory system that doesn't allow for people to have a home. It doesn't allow for people to have food unless you can afford it. And of course, at the same time, it creates a system where people can't afford things. So you have groups of people that can afford and groups of people that can't afford. And without having that unequal society, that unequal structure of the society, capitalism wouldn't be able to survive either. So it's inherently built into the capitalist system. But then Thomas Malthus says, oh, well, that's just because they breed too much. There's too many of us. There's too many of them, and let's do away with them somehow. Rather than saying, oh, let's have a look at our system. Let's see where we can improve things. Let's see how we can build things to make things more efficient. Let's see how we can deal with this crisis of not having enough food, when in fact it's an absolute fallacy that we don't even have enough food. We can feed the world 10 times over or more with the amount of food that we produce. But why can't we feed the world? Because it's not profitable. Somebody's not making money out of it.
That's right.
So Thomas Malthus is pointing the finger at the ordinary person, saying, do away with yourselves because you're unproductive and you're making a mess of our society. Okay. Yeah.
That's a good one. Did you want to ask a next question? And also Dustin's got one too.
Why does development like the Silk Road spark progressive change?
That's a good one. I was actually looking at that, having a great think about it. Now, for those of you wondering what Silk Road's, the One Belt, One Road initiative as well, there's actually some documentaries on that. If you go to RT, they've got that stuff on about the new Silk Road. Some fascinating. It's basically where I'm seeing as a progressive change is actually allowing developing nations, some people call it third world, that to actually now have an alternative they can look to instead of the traditional free trade, liberal order they've had, and going through the IMF to not even develop it, to basically destroy their countries. They now look at something that they can rebuild their economy again. They can build their infrastructure, basic things from clean running water through to electricity, right through to actually building new industries and helping to move forward. That's what the Silk Road's all about. It's quite an alternative compared to the traditional one we've known. The people call globalism, liberalism, whatever you want to call it, through the IMF and the World Trade Organization, which demands, which basically, when we talked about imperialism at the start of the show, it's requiring most of the world to be brutally poor, repressed and brutally poor, in destitution, poverty, to maintain the monopoly of the very few, which is be it Wall Street, the Eastern establishment, the oil bankers, and big finance institutions, etc. And that's what basically we're seeing, where the Silk Road's an alternative to that. We're saying, well, you no longer have to. Here's the alternative. This is where it can be quite progressive in a sense. Well, there is an alternative. This myth is saying this is how it always is. Greed is good. We always have to continue to suffer. No, we don't. This is it. And there's an opportunity now for all those nations. Pakistan's jumping on board. I believe a lot of Central Asian countries, and now a lot of those in the Middle East are jumping on. African nations are jumping on board. No doubt, Central and Southern American countries are looking to jump on board. I believe actually Mexico's starting to have talks with China about. Don't quote me on it, but which would be right on the border of the US there. So it will cause a lot of calamity that for the Wall Street, etc. But however, I mean, this is where it can be shown. Once you go, there's the alternative. Here's an alternative. We can move forward, and that will help then to establish all those that do jump on board with the new Silk Road, or the One Belt, One Road initiative, to actually then empower their own people, their own nations, and forge their own way forward instead of being dictated to by US foreign policy, which is just basically a failed business plan. Mm. Mm.
And I think it's important to point out what it is that the IMF does to the developing world. So when and I'm no expert on it by any means, but for anybody that's listening that thinks that the IMF is some kind of benevolent bank that gives out money to poor countries because they don't know how to manage their finances, it's not quite true. The World Bank the IMF does give out money to poor nations with a whole lot of contracts or restrictions on what they can spend that money on, and in order to pay back that money, the IMF dictates how that economy is how that economy must cut back on all social spending in order to pay back that money to the IMF. So on the one hand, they lend money in order that a country can improve its economic situation, but then it imposes such harsh repayments on those countries that the people suffer anyway. So it is definitely not a benevolent organization that hands out money to developing countries so that they can improve their economic situation. Whereas the Silk Road is based on a win-win type of situation where China can freely trade with the world and will, in order to do that trade, They invest in that country and develop and gives very favourable terms and conditions to repaying the loan. So it's a big difference compared to what the IMF is doing, that's for sure. And of course, that's why so many countries are adopting it.
That's right. And what's interesting, if you saw last weekend's G7, guess who was there? Not just the heads of the respective countries, but the IMF dictating, and what they were trying to regulate up as an alternative to the Silk Road, which will be a horrible package. It'll be the same thing repackaged. It's like a turd. This time they're just sprinkling hundreds of thousands of it and putting a little ribbon around it and trying to repackage it back to these countries to attract them back on, because they know these countries are moving away from the US dollar. Now, if they don't trade in US dollars, the US dollar will just collapse even further. I mean, sometimes you think it's quite laughable, and quite frankly, it was quite bold. Yet it was opened up with the Queen of, with the head of state, the Queen, who's senile as anything. They gave her a sword. She was waving that around the air, nearly chopped Camilla's head off. Then she went to slice a cake with it, using the wrong side. And then they think, oh, you need a knife for that. And then it just got even further. I mean, you had the President of the United States. I mean, okay, dementia's a serious problem, but I mean, Christ's sakes, you can't tell the difference between his sister and his wife. I mean, and he's going to Russia to tell President Putin off about some mythological thing that Russia's getting involved in their politics. I mean, these imperialists have just lost the plot. I mean, it's it'd be hilarious if it wasn't so serious. But and this is what they're trying to repackage it again. I mean, I think a lot of developing nations just wake up. No, thank you. Thanks, but no thanks. We've now got an alternative to go to, and they can see that threat coming from a mile away. And look, when Biden's trying to tell Putin off, I mean, Putin will just tell him to go away, basically you're not going to get anything out of it. So it'll just all do is just be proved highly entertaining in the media. Now, I think we'll sort of wind this up, but Dust actually asked a very interesting question. I'll flash that up, press show, and it says, how do we balance fighting against the old order and building a new one? And I think that's a really interesting question about that. I believe we've actually touched on that, really, where Silk Road provided an alternative in one aspect, because we do need an alternative. It's an interesting, I think it was an old Docker or old Boilermaker told me this many years ago. He was an old communist. He's dead now. He's been passed away years back. But he told me one thing. If we're going to be fighting about something in the system, we need to make sure we've got an alternative. If you have an argument against something, what's the alternative? And I think we've got something. We've actually demonstrated, history show there is an alternative, and we've got one now underway again, saying there's an alternative against the established global order. So I mean, that's one we can balance it up, and then I think the question for us is how we're going to organise to also fight against the excesses and the horrible policies, etc., that's imposed on us by the current order of things.
Yeah, and I think. I think, when I became involved in left-wing politics, I was 15 or so, and had unfortunately a bit of left-wing extremism about me. I thought that we were going to be smashing the system and fighting the cops and charging the castles and shooting people and so on, because Mao said out of the barrel of a gun. And so I'm thinking, oh great, we're going to have a revolution, it's all going to be violence and so on, and it really hasn't been until the last kind of five years or so, realizing that really maybe 10 years, but really what we need to be doing is building an an alternative. Fighting against the old order is not necessary, really, if we're presenting an alternative, if we're presenting a viable new system that people want to be on board with, and the system itself will be the ones fighting us, and that's the truth. There will be violence, but it won't be on our side. We won't need to fight to win, because we'll be winning because we're presenting an alternative. The system itself, the current system, will be fighting us to try and maintain its socials, its system. It wants to maintain the status quo, and there will be pushback from them, against the rise of the new system. But I think that when we look at countries and when you read the constitutions that these new systems have in place, the first thing that happens when a new government forms in these independent countries is that they develop a new constitution. And when you read the Venezuelan constitution, you read Cuba's constitution, and you read the Soviet Union, the first thing the Bolsheviks did was develop a new constitution. Peru Libre has just developed, their program and their constitution that they're putting forward. It's absolutely fantastic stuff. In Australia, we don't even talk about people in our constitution. We just talk about how our parliament operates, and it's a rubbish constitution. We need to change it. We need to forge ahead with a new constitution, a new country, a new way of doing things, and forget about smashing things down.
And actually, Frank, Ace Frank, I'll just call him Frank. Obviously, you asked the thoughts on Pedro Castillo in Peru, because you and I were discussing it. We've actually got copies of their program, and it's very good. And even when they developed it, when they're in opposition, they developed it in such a way that they're going to be governing. They're preparing themselves to govern, and they have an alternative. We're mentioning about a constitution. My thoughts, Frank, I think that's a huge step forward for Peru. Well done, and well done to the people of Peru as well. I think that it's been a big shot in the arm for the revolutionary movements around the world, the one warm the other. And I think for us here in Australia, there's a lot to learn from that. And I think, a proper program, something, an alternative, a viable alternative to put forward to the people here in this country. I think that's what needs to happen. Sure, it's going to be hard. It's going to be not an easy thing to do, but it needs to happen. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I agree. I know that a lot of the left here in Australia puts forward 10-point plans as to how we're going to achieve something or what we can do. But it doesn't really get to the heart and soul of the problem. It doesn't really forge a new way forward. It talks about nationalising industry, sure, but it's such a broad thing. But when you read other people's constitutions, they say exactly how they're going to do it and exactly what that means and how that's going to benefit the people. And it's fantastic. Yeah, and I think for us here in Australia, I mean, when I've heard people talk about constitution here and how the Governor General should do this, X, Y, Z, and all this, I think we've got to understand the history of our constitution here in Australia. It was developed for both respective federal government and state governments, and even local, how they're going to administer capital on behalf of the multinationals, and that's what that's there for. It's not a constitution for the people. We don't even have a Bill of Rights, for Christ's sake. So, I mean, and I think something like what they've done in Peru, I think this would be a good alternative to actually study. We can talk about probably something in the future to study that and study what's happened with Venezuela. I believe actually people in Chile too are pushing like hell to actually have a new constitution as well. So it comes to show you things can happen. You have the movement on the ground. And I think it's something, well, yeah, we do need to forge a new way. So I don't have anything else to say. Did you want to add anything else? Well, actually, just on Peru, because the opposition still saying that the election has been a farce, and
of course they would.
So of course, and the margin was so tiny, and of course the opposition would be saying that. So what's going to be interesting is how is Peru Libre going to deal with this situation, and really that's gonna be the mass mobilization of the people out in the street to say this is, to put their money where their mouth is and say this is what we want, a new system. Otherwise, like in Chile, it could be another coup. It could be a military takeover, and unless we get the masses out on the streets we start to form militias so that we can defend the revolutions and defend the changes that we want to bring in, then it's it possibly might not work. Might not work. So let's hope that Peru Libre can see the way forward and see what they need to do to cement that victory that they've just achieved.
And I just think actually history, this is where we've been talking about learning from history. I remember Chile, Allende's Chile, right? But I mean, a great man, like his government, real good in that. But the fact is, and would still warranted our support at the end of the day. But the fact is, what they did was just wanted to make reforms within the system. They didn't want to actually absolutely change it. Well, unlike now, and this is where history is very good for us to learn from our losses as well, where they're saying, well, it's not just the government that needs to change and reforms. You need to change the system overall. Hence, what they're doing, what they're trying to do in Peru, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc. And what's the other one? Bolivia as well, and they're moving forward as well. And I think that's what vitally important. Yes, reforms are important, and some of them should warrant our support. But they're not the be all and end all. We do need to look at it, and that's why it's vitally important that we have something that we can fight for one way or the other. So, well, I think we're going to call it tonight. It's nearly 8:30, and that look for all those who had actually joined on. Look, thank you for watching tonight. Please share far and wide, like everything. If you wish to actually be part of it, just feel free to send me a message on Facebook Messenger, or if you're on my Twitter account, know me there. Just send me a message, and certainly I'd like to invite you on and be involved in a broader discussion. We are a study group, and we are Builders Australia, but especially to our Australian audience as well. I know you just do watch this, but if you want to be involved, send me a message. I would love to have you. We're trying to build our own, basically our own CPI Centre for Political Innovation here, our own socialist think tank as well, to spread it among the ordinary people. So, once again, thank you very much tonight. We'll end it off. Do you want to end it off? Do you want to finish it off?
I would like to say viva to the Americas.
Yes.
And dare to struggle, dare to win.
Dare to struggle, dare to win. Thank you, everyone. All the best.